So in this video today, I'm going to be providing you with a complete guide to the DJI Osmo Action 5 Pro. Now, I've owned every DJI Osmo Action camera since the very first Osmo Action came out several years ago. And I've used each of those Osmo Action cameras for hiking, biking, and other outdoor adventures, including some vlogging and nighttime usage as well. And in order to make this video as easy to navigate as possible, I've created a table of contents below so you can easily skip ahead or revisit any sections that you need to. All right, so to unbox this camera here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna turn it over and we're gonna pull right here where it says open. And this, of course, is the standard combo. We're gonna slide out the camera. Gonna set that aside for now. And we're gonna pull out this little box here that says accessories. So let's open up this box of accessories first. First of all, inside here, we have the optional case that you can install on your Osmo Action 5 Pro. I will show you how to mount that in a little bit here. We also have the thumb screw right here. We have the battery, and we'll talk a little more about the battery in a moment, but this battery is bigger than the battery on the Osmo Action 4, but the runtime in the Osmo Action 5 Pro is much longer than the Osmo Action 4, so we'll talk about that in a moment. And down in here, we also have a couple different types of mounts. Right here, we have the curved adhesive mount, and then down under here, we of course have the classic magnetic mount. I'll show you how to attach that in a moment. In addition, in the accessories box, we have the USB-C to USB-C cable. This is useful when you need to plug in the camera to charge the battery or to connect it to a PC or Mac computer. And in addition, we have some stickers down in here, as well as some of the manuals and paperwork. And of course, the most exciting item here is the actual Osmo Action 5 Pro body. So I'm gonna get that out of its bag, pull off some of the stickers. It's one of my favorite parts. First of all, I wanna show you the magnetic mount. So the way to attach the mount is we've got the base right here, and here's the mount. And the DJI text on here, you want that to face toward the front of the camera. So we're gonna do this, and it's gonna latch right there into place. Just wanna make sure this is snug right here, and that it's not crooked and there's no gap. And then this is what it's gonna look like on the front. So we're gonna have the latch right here with the DJI wording right there. And then I'm going to connect it right here. So we're just gonna put the feet on the latch down between the corresponding gaps there. And then we can take the thumb screw and we're gonna put it in right here. And we're just gonna tighten that. All right. And the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about some of the physical buttons on here before we turn it on. So first of all, this button right here on top is the record shutter button. So I'm gonna turn it here so you can see it as well. That is a record button right there. And also here on top, these right here, these are speakers. So anytime you're playing back a file on your Osmo Action 5 Pro, that's where the speakers are located. And of course, back here at the back, this is the touchscreen. And if we rotate it around here, on this side right here is the on-off power button. This also is the quick switch button to switch between modes. And then down here, this is the USB-C port cover. So in order to open it, you just pull down on this little latch, and inside you're going to see the USB-C port right there. And when you go to close the door, just make sure these red dots are not showing here. That represents that the door is open and not sealed entirely. Your camera will not be waterproof if it's not sealed. So when you close it, just pop it up just like that. It'll latch nicely into place and you'll know you have it securely closed. And going around to the front here, first of all, this is the lens. Specifically, this is the lens cover right here. And if you find you ever need to remove the lens cover, let's say you have some type of filter you want to put on there, or if you accidentally smash this and you need to replace it with a new one, what you do is you just turn like this and it's going to loosen. It's on threads here, and then it's going to pop off just like that. And then in order to install it, you're just going to put it back on and you're going to turn clockwise to tighten it. And on the front here, you also have two microphones. So one microphone is located right in here, and the other microphone is located right in here behind the 5. In addition, here in the middle of the O, you may notice the O looks a little bit different there. That is the color temperature sensor. So that is going to adjust your white balance for you. That's going to help keep that color accurate in your video, photo, and time-lapse footage. And finally, let's rotate to this side right here. So the side with the DJI logo, this is where your battery goes. So this is the battery compartment cover. And in order to install the battery, you're gonna push in slightly and lift up on this arrow, and the door is gonna open right there. Since we're here, let's pop in our battery. You want to make sure the contacts here line up with the contacts in there. So we're going to pop it in just like this. In addition, this is also where the microSD card slot is. But brand new with the Osmo Action 5 Pro is there's internal storage, and that internal storage is 48 gigabytes. And what that 48 gigabytes allows for is it allows you to record footage directly to it. You don't have to have a microSD card. But if you want to add a microSD card, which I'm going to, because I don't want to run low on storage, and this is the microSD card that I use with this camera. I prefer the SanDisk Extreme Pro, and this one is a 512 gigabyte one. So in order to insert the microSD card, you want to put it with the text facing toward the battery here. Then it's going to pop into place just like that. And then in order to close the battery door, you're just going to lift up and you're going to press down. It's going to lock into place. And once again, you just want to make sure you don't see any ride around here. Otherwise, it's not waterproofed. And one other thing that is new with the Osmo Action 5 Pro is underneath here on this side, there's a pressure sensor. And we're going to talk a little bit more later on about what that does, but it's a very cool feature and it's useful if you're like me and you do hiking, or if you like to go underwater, it's also useful for that. And before we proceed with turning on the camera here, I would like to show you how to put it inside this case right here. Now you don't have to use this case, and I generally do not, but one thing to note is if you do use this case, it does have a mount right here on the side where you can vertically mount it. So this mount right here, you can attach to the case here. So if you want to film vertically to not miss out on any resolution, you can put your camera inside here and mount it that way. So it's good if you want anything for TikTok, Instagram, or a YouTube short. You can film vertically using the entire sensor. So I'm gonna unclip this from the magnets here. And in order to mount it in here, what you wanna do is you wanna hold it like this, and you wanna make sure it's open, and you're going to slide it in from the front, like that right there. And then you're just gonna push down here, and you're gonna have that nice latching sound. It's gonna latch into place, and then if you want to vertical mount it, you of course can just attach it like that, and you've got yourself a vertical mount. But I'm going to put it back to horizontal for the rest of this video. So I'm gonna take it back out of the case here. To remove it, you just lift up and you push out. All right, so it's time to do that first time power on. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna push and hold on the quick switch. And one thing I noticed right away, that was a very fast power on. It was like almost instant there, so very good. So first of all, I'm gonna select my language here, which is English. And it's going to tell us that we need to activate the camera using the DJI Mimo app. So I'm going to do that. Now you can skip up to 5 times. You can pull this and skip it, but I would like to show you the activation process so that you can be familiar with that. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm going to scan that QR code with my phone, and I'm gonna open that link there, and I'm gonna get into the DJI Mimo app here, and you just wanna make sure Bluetooth is turned on your smartphone, and then you're gonna click connect right here. And if your app needs updating, it's going to prompt for the app update. In my case, my app does need updating, so I need to go and download it, an update to the app on the App Store. So I'm gonna click update, and I'm gonna let it finish. The app is done updating now, so I'm gonna power this on again. That update was about 1.04 gigabytes, so it did take a little bit over a somewhat weak cellular connection. All right, so I'm gonna click connect, and it's gonna reconnect to our device here. And then the firmware is going to start installing. So we're gonna click join to the Wi-Fi network there. All right, so we're gonna click install here now, and it's going to rapidly install the firmware. And on the screen, you're going to see update in progress, wait 2 minutes. And then the status is gonna continue to count up in the DJI Mimo app. All right, finally, update success. And you see the updated in green there at the top. I'm going to first of all show you how to operate the touchscreen. So if you tap on the touchscreen, it's gonna bring up the options here, and it's gonna show you some different info on the screen. First of all, up here is the amount of time left that you can record to the internal storage in this current mode. That of course is going to change depending on what mode you're in. But currently, if you're in 1080p, it can record about 3 hours to the internal storage. Over here is the battery status. So if you click on it, it'll show you the percentage. Right now we have 52% charge. And over here is where you can do playback. So if you have any files recorded on the storage, you can click there on the play icon, and it's going to let you play them. Down here in the lower left, if you click on this, this is where you can toggle between the different modes, which we'll get into in a moment. At the bottom here, these are some of the specific shooting parameters. If you click on those, you've got a bunch of different parameters you can adjust here. We'll get into those in a moment as well. And then over here is the digital zoom on the lower right. So if you want to zoom, you can tap and hold that, and you can zoom in or zoom out. And then finally over here, these are the more detailed shooting parameters. But before we get into those detailed modes, the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to go through the general settings with you. So to get to that general menu, we're going to swipe down from the top. And first of all, if you click here, this is where you can create and manage custom modes. So if you click on that, this is where basically you can save presets. So right now I don't have anything to save, but I will show you that later on. Right here, this is the quick switch menu. So if you click that, that's going to give you some different options here for what you would like to include with the quick switch. And a reminder, the quick switch is going to be when you click the QS button right here. So you can decide what you would like to add to that. By default, photo and video are there, but then there's a whole bunch of other ones down here that you can select or choose between, depending on what you would like to be there. Right here is the screen brightness. By default, it is set to 90, and I do recommend 90. 90 is a good default there. And it's a little bit better than setting it to 100, because when you set it to 100, it's going to use more battery power, and 90 is usually more than bright enough. This button right here, this is where we're gonna have a bunch of detailed settings. So snapshot, if you click on this, snapshot is going to be if you click the shutter button right here and the camera powers on, it's going to start doing whatever you last had it set to by default, or you can set it to video or hyperlapse. I usually keep it to whatever you last set it to. I find that that works best for me if I want to quickly power this on and capture whatever I'm capturing. And single screen preview, this is the screen is off when locked. You can turn that on or you can leave it off. I usually just leave that off by default. Now for wireless mic, if you do own the DJI Mic 2, you can now connect 2 transmitters to this. With the Osmo Action 4, you can only connect 1. So the nice thing is you could be wearing a mic and you could have someone else wearing a mic, and you can both transmit to the same video feed. So this is where it's going to show you the status when those are connected. And if you like to do voice control, you can turn that on, and then you want to set it to your language here. Then if you click down here, it's going to show you a list of the voice commands that you can use. There are 4 right there. For the depth and altitude, this is a new feature on the Osmo Action 5 Pro. And if you go for diving, if you click on depth display, when the water depth is greater than 3.3 feet, it's going to automatically display the water depth. And then if you want the camera to record it, you can click auto record, and it's going to start video recording when you reach a certain depth. Then you also can set auto stop if you want it to stop recording after ending that water depth. So this is kind of a cool feature where you can have your Osmo Action 5 Pro start recording automatically when you get down to a certain depth. And then hiking and parachuting, you can have it display the altitude, and then you can do the absolute or the relative. And it says right there, relative altitude is recommended. And then units, I'm going to change this to feet because in the United States we use feet. And then for the always on display, I'm going to keep that on. And then the style, you can choose between a bunch of different styles, which is very cool. I'm going to just keep it with the full standard brightness right there. And then if you want to do the built-in mic audio backup, you can toggle this option on, and it's going to give you a bunch of exceptions to it though. Like it's unable to save audio with videos recorded at such and such frame rates. So keep that in mind. If you do turn this on, there are several exceptions to that. But I do like to have this on. It's good to have that backup just in case something happens with your wireless mics when you have them paired to this. You don't want to be without audio entirely. For the USB-C mode here, it tells you to use Type-C to Type-C power delivery cable to connect camera to Android, PC, or Mac. So when you have the USB connected, it's going to give you different options under there. With the wireless connection, I recommend keeping this on. That way you can connect to your camera anytime you need to from the DJI Mimo app. For the sounds, I like to put these to medium or low. Generally medium. High is a little bit too loud on here, but medium is usually just right. For the grid, I like to have this on, and that way it's going to give you your lines, crossways, and up and down. That really helps me with placing a subject eyes in the upper third, or if a subject is moving left to right, I like to keep 2/3 of the frame in front of them. So this display is really helpful with that. And then time code, if you need to use time coding, you can turn that on and you can use that. That can be useful if you have several different cameras and you need to sync them. For the naming management, you can do a bunch of customization here. I usually just stick with the default that DJI has set up on here, but if you want to customize, There's a bunch of options there for folder name and file name. For the auto power off, I do like to keep this at the default of 5 minutes. That way, if my camera accidentally gets powered on, or if it's sitting there powered on, not doing anything, it'll power off after 5 minutes and save some of my battery. For the horizon calibration, I do recommend doing this the first time. So I'm gonna click on that. And I recommend doing this every once in a while. And then the continue last live stream option, this is gonna be if things get cut off in the middle of the live stream, it's going to pick back up where it left off. If you have a Bluetooth remote control, this is where you would connect it. And then for the language, you just want to make sure this is set to your language. For the date and time, I like to just confirm that's correct on here. It is going to sync with the Mimo app, so generally, you're not going to have to do much there. And then if you ever need to do a factory reset, you'll click down here. This is going to reset all of your settings on the camera back to the way they came when you first unboxed it. And if you ever need the device serial number or to check the firmware, this is where you'll check it. In addition, there's a quick start guide and an export log. That log is going to be if DJI ever needs that for troubleshooting, if you ever have any issues with your camera. So we've gone through all of those. The next one here is this one right here. If you want the orientation lock on or off, that's where you can adjust it. I do like to keep the orientation lock on, so I'm going to keep that clicked right there. Right here is where you can lock the screen. This is good if you're controlling it via a remote and you don't want to accidentally change something on here, or if you have the camera underwater, so the water pressing on the screen does not change something on you. And in order to unlock, you're just going to swipe up from the bottom. Then over here is enable or disable voice control. I actually don't really use voice control with this camera, so I'm going to keep it disabled. And then finally, if you want to enable or disable the full front screen display, this is where you'll toggle that. I do like to enable it, so I'm going to click right there to make sure it's enabled. And then when we swipe left, there's going to be the storage menu here. And I love it that this camera has the internal storage now. I think that's really great, especially if I was to forget my card. That internal storage in 4K 30 can do about an hour and a half of footage, which is really quite a good amount. Of course, I put my microSD card in here, so if I click on that, it's going to offer me the option to switch to that storage. I'm going to click confirm because that has a lot more storage space, so I'm going to switch to that. And then if you want to ever format your storage, these options are right here. So I am going to format the internal storage just to start it off fresh. And then the SD card, I'm going to do the same thing. Just do note that I will delete any files on there. So before you format it, make sure you have any files off that you need. So now we're going to talk about setting up the shooting parameters. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to swipe up from the bottom. And first of all, here's where you can adjust your resolution. And I do, in general, recommend filming in either 4K 16:9 or 4K 4:3. Now, the main advantage of 4K 4:3 is you can adjust the footage later on vertically. You have extra resolution. And even if you're doing a finished product in a 16:9 timeline with that 16:9 aspect ratio, you can still do some fine tuning with how you frame your shots. But if you know you're not going to want to do that at all, then I recommend doing 4K 16:9. And then down here at the bottom is where you can set your frames per second. So you have 24 all the way up to 120. Now, what you set this to is largely going to depend on what you want to do with that footage later on. And the nice thing on the Osmo Action 5 Pro is in 4K 4:3, you can also do 120 frames per second now. So if you want to do any type of slow motion later on, I do recommend filming in 4K 16:9 or 4K 4:3 with 120. It's going to give you some phenomenal slow motion that you can slow down either 4 times or 5 times if your timeline is 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second, respectively. If you want a mode that you can slow down a little bit up to 40 or 50%, then you could do 4K 60. And then if you just want a standard mode where you're talking to the camera, I recommend 4K 30 or 4K 24. I personally like 4K 24 when I'm talking to the camera and I don't want to do any slowing down, but you have a lot of options there. And then up here, this is the RockSteady and lens option. So if you want to get the gyro data, say you're using this on a gimbal, you can use a program such as Gyroflow later on to stabilize this if you don't want in-camera stabilization. But generally, I do standard RockSteady because I like the stabilization. It's really nice. The only modes where you may not want to use RockSteady is anytime you have a shutter speed that's slower than about 1/200. It is going to introduce some jitter and ghosting into your footage. So if you're using ND filters and doing the 180-degree shutter angle, or if you're doing low light filming, then it may be beneficial to have this on a gimbal with RockSteady off. And then over here for the lens, you've got a couple different options. If you want to have the standard D-warp where nothing has that fisheye look, you can select that. If you want to do wide, wide is right there. Then if you want to do ultra wide, which is really wide, you can select that. And do note, if you go to RockSteady Plus, that's going to introduce some additional crop. And you can also only go up to wide in RockSteady Plus. You can't do ultra wide. That's part of the reason I like RockSteady. I find RockSteady is more than good enough, and it does offer me the maximum lens options here. In general, I do like using the standard D-warp mode, unless I have RockSteady off entirely, in which case I do have to set it to wide. Otherwise, there will not be any gyro data with that video file. So that is something really important to note. You have to be in the wide lens. And then of course up here, this is where you can change your modes. So the standard video mode is the default, but this camera does also have a pre-record mode, and you can use the pre-record in the video and SuperNight Mode. And what you do is you tap the upper left corner to enable it right here. And then when enabled, the camera is going to pre-record footage within that set time duration. So if we keep it at 15 seconds, the camera is going to constantly be recording footage up to 15 seconds before pushing this button to record. So this is useful if you're like at an athletic event and you're waiting for something exciting to happen, waiting for somebody to make a big catch, somebody to make a big play, somebody to score a goal. You can have your camera not recording, but just sitting here, ready. And then when somebody makes the goal, you can push this and it's going to start recording, and it's going to go back to the 15 seconds before. And then it's going to count up to the 15 seconds. And then once it gets to the 15 seconds, it's going to continue recording. Then if you want it to get out of that mode, just tap the pre-record stopped, and it's going to take it out of that mode. And of course, you can go way back to up to 1 minute before. In general, for the pre-record mode, if you're going to use it, I recommend something like 30 seconds. I find that works best, and it gives a little bit more context to the scene that you're filming. The other mode here is loop recording. So when enabled, the camera is going to record a video by overwriting the older footage with new footage at selected time intervals. So what this function does is it allows the camera to save space on the microSD card, and it's great to use in scenes where you're waiting to capture unanticipated highlights, such as when driving. I generally only use the video in pre-rec mode, and 90% of the time I use the video mode. But I wanted to show you those functions there in case you ever want to use those. Now, if you do film in 4K 16:9, you do have horizon balancing. And what that horizon balancing allows you to do is it allows you to tilt the camera up to 45 degrees, and it's still going to keep the horizon steady. If you go beyond 45 degrees, you're going to lose that horizon balancing. But if you do want the complete horizon steady, where you can rotate it 360 degrees, you do have to go down to 2.7K 16:9, and that then becomes an option there. So I don't find myself usually using the horizon steady because I want to have footage that's at least 4K. But if you do ever find yourself wanting to use that, just note you do have to go down to 2.7K 16:9. So now that we're back to the main screen here, I wanted to show you the more advanced image parameters here on the right. So first thing you want to do is you want to click Pro. That's going to unlock all of the settings here. And there are a couple settings here that I recommend changing. So under exposure, there are a couple parameters I like to adjust on here, but first of all, I'm going to keep auto, but I'm going to set the ISO range to 100 to 1600. I find that works best, and it helps prevent that digital noise and grain if the ISO gets higher. And then for the EV value, I like to set this to negative 0.3. I find that helps preserve the details a little bit better in the highlights, when sometimes those highlights can get blown out. And then if you ever want to set any of these settings manually, like if you're using ND filters and you want to do the 180-degree shutter angle, all you have to do is click on M, and that's where you can adjust the shutter speed right here. I'm going to put this back to auto, and even though it's auto, it's still got these established parameters that I set here, which is very nice. If you ever want to see what ISO it's using, up here at the top, it's showing the ISO value. For white balance, you can keep this set to auto if you want to, but what I usually like to do is I like to set it to manual, because I like it to maintain the same white balance in all my footage. And if it's daytime like this, I like to set it to 5600K. I find that gives best results. But if it is sunrise or sunset, then I recommend setting this to 6500K. For the color mode, you've got several different options here. Now you can do normal 8-bit, you can do normal 10-bit, you can do HLG 10-bit, you can do D-Log-M 10-bit. So I love it that they added HLG 10-bit, and that is a new HDR mode. And HLG is really good for HDR. It's that true HDR. So if you want to film any HDR footage that you can then display later on an HDR capable monitor or TV, that's the mode you'd want to use. Do note that when you're editing that HLG footage, you'll need a monitor or screen that is able to show you that HLG HDR. It needs to have the right color gamut. But if you don't want to do any color grading, I do recommend using the normal 10-bit mode. 10-bit may not seem like much of a difference from 8-bit, but 10-bit is 1 billion possible color shades, whereas 8-bit is only 16 million possible color shades. You may not notice the difference in all filming situations, but if you do have the sky in your scene or something like that, you'll often see banding in the sky and it looks kind of bad in 8-bit, but in 10-bit you have a nice smooth color gradient. But if you do want to grade the footage later on, I recommend doing D-Log-M 10-bit. With that D-Log-M 10-bit, that gives you the most flexibility later on to color grade that footage. And the nice thing on the Osmo Action 5 Pro is you can use color recovery. And what color recovery on is going to do is it's going to give you an approximation of what your final image will look like later on versus it looking all washed out on the screen. So I like to use color recovery. It's basically like putting a LUT on your footage while you're filming it on the camera. And then down here, there's a couple of image adjustments. If you click custom, it's going to let you adjust the texture. I like to put the texture down to -2. That's essentially the equivalence of putting the sharpness down as low as it will go. I can always add back some texture or sharpness later on when editing. But if you're not going to edit at all later on, then I recommend doing 0 or -1. But I don't ever recommend going above 0. It's going to give you this really sharp looking image and it doesn't look that great when it's overly sharp. So I recommend never going above 0. And then for noise reduction, depending on how much you want the camera to do in body, you can adjust this. If you're not going to do any editing later on, I recommend keeping the noise reduction set right there at 0. But if you are going to edit later on, you're going to add your own noise reduction later on, or if you're filming in good lighting, then I recommend putting this down to -2. I find that footage looks a little bit better. If you have the noise reduction at 0 or 1, I find it can make the footage look extra soft sometimes in a bad way. So I do like using -2 there. And finally, we want to click on the mic symbol right here. And this is a few different audio parameters. So the first thing here under channel, you can select mono or stereo. Generally, I just keep this set to stereo. I find that gives the best results. And then for wind noise over here, you've got a couple different options. You can do off, where there's not going to be any wind noise reduction. You can do standard, or you can do high. So if you're outside on a really windy day in a place where there's a lot of wind, you'll probably want to put this to high. But if it is really windy, you're going to get a lot better results if you have the DJI Mic 2, because you're going to be able to put that wind muff on there, and it's going to record a lot better audio. In general, I just keep this set at standard, and I find that gives good enough results. So this is an audio test with the DJI Osmo Action 5 Pro. I'm just using the built-in microphones on the camera right here, just to see how good it sounds, or doesn't sound. I did not bring my DJI Mic 2 with me today, so any audio from the camera is going to be directly from the camera and not from any other external mic. So now that I've set up this first preset, what I'm going to do is I'm going to toggle down and I'm going to click right here and I'm going to save this current setting. And for the symbol, I am going to select vlog for this, because this is going to be my 4K 24. If I'm talking to the camera, that's going to be my vlogging mode. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up a 4K 4:3 120 so I can record my slow motion footage. And I'm going to toggle down here. I'm going to click on that again. And this one, I'm going to pick a symbol that makes sense here. Let's select running for that. And then finally, I'm going to do a 4K 4:3 60 mode. It's going to be kind of that intermediate mode where I can do a little bit of slow motion, but not a lot. And for that one, I'm going to save it just as my standard video mode. So let's go to photo mode next. And if you want to take photos on here, this mode offers quite a few options. I like to do L for large. It's going to use the entire sensor, that L 4:3, and it's going to be 40 megapixels, which is much higher than the Osmo Action 4, which was around 10. And then down here, if you want to set any type of burst mode where it'll take a certain amount of images per second, that's where you can adjust that. But I usually keep that off. But if you do want to do that, that's where you can adjust it. And then up here, for the focal length, you can do standard dewarp if you don't want any fisheye in your photo, or you can keep it set to wide. I generally keep it set to wide for the photo mode. And then if you want any type of countdown, just click up there. And that can be good because when you hit this to take a photo, the countdown is going to make sure there's no wobble still happening when you take the photo. I usually set it to 3 seconds. And then the parameters over here, exposure, I generally just let the photos do the auto exposure. Usually I don't find there's a reason not to. So I usually just keep all of those set to auto. The same thing with the white balance. This camera does a good job of figuring that out. But for the format, I like to do JPEG plus RAW. That way it gives me that RAW file later on if I would like to do any editing with that file. All right, had to relocate a bit. I had several yellow jackets swarming this camera. Apparently they like my Sony, but they left the Osmo Action 5 Pro alone. So if you don't like yellow jackets, this camera doesn't seem to attract them. So that's good. But my Sony, they love my Sony for some reason. But anyway, those are the settings I recommend for photo mode. And then for the SuperNight Mode, this mode is brand new to the Osmo Action 5 Pro. And this mode, as you might guess by the name, this one is recommended for nighttime. So for this one, I like to do 4K 24 frames per second. And this one, if you are going to use it on a gimbal, then I do recommend turning off RockSteady and keeping it wide. And then there's some other parameters I'll show you in a moment. But if you're not going to use it on a gimbal, then I recommend just keeping RockSteady on. And for the advanced parameters over here, for the exposure, you don't have any options here. Under the ISO, you have to keep the full range. But with this mode, I generally just keep it set to auto because the AI within this camera is going to get you the best results that it can with the lighting that it has to work with. For the white balance, I recommend changing that to M if you're going to film several clips and you want to edit later on. But if you're not going to do any editing later on, you could keep that at auto. But for nighttime, I like a 3800K white balance. I like the colors that gives. It tends to keep the colors pretty accurate at nighttime. So I'm going to put it to 3800K. And then the stabilization, this is important to note. If you are walking at nighttime and you're just walking along or vlogging, then you can do daily. But if you're doing sport stuff in nighttime with a lot of movement with this camera, you want to do sport. And that's going to help this camera internally minimize or prevent any of that ghosting and jitter of your footage. If you've seen it before, you know what it looks like. It looks really bad. I recommend just keeping this at daily unless you are doing something really intense at nighttime. And then something that's new with the Osmo Action 5 Pro is subject tracking. But something to note is subject tracking will only work up to 2.7K 9:16. In other words, you cannot use this in 4K, unfortunately. And you're also limited to just a standard dewarp mode in that highest resolution. So if you want to do subject tracking with this, you can do that. Right now, you can see me on there. And if I move, it's going to track me. But of course, unlike cameras like the DJI Osmo Pocket 3, this camera is not going to be able to rotate on a gimbal. So that's why you can only do this in 2.7K. But this can be great if you want some type of tracking while vlogging and you're doing something vertical, like for Instagram or YouTube Short. This mode is great for that. And then a dedicated slow motion mode here. With this one, you can go up to 4K and you can do 4K 120. I generally, though, I don't like to use the slow motion mode unless I know for sure that I don't want any audio or I don't want actual speed, because in the slow motion mode, it is going to record it in slow motion and you can't have it at normal speed. It's going to be already slowed down in the file. But it can be great if you don't want to do any slowing down when editing later on. If you want the file to come right out of the camera slowed down, then that's the perfect mode to use. And of course up here, you can change the lens focal length. For that, I generally just keep it set to wide. But if you do 1080p, you can go up to 8x slow-mo, so you can do 1080p 240. So you do have that option as well. And finally, we've got our time-lapse mode here. So time-lapse is one of those things I do enjoy doing with the Osmo Action cameras. It's a lot of fun on these. And since these are waterproof, I don't have to worry if it rains or snows or anything like that. My camera is going to be fine. So for time-lapse mode, you've got hyperlapse, of course, too. So I'm going to show you that first. Hyperlapse, I always like to do that in 4K, and 4K 30 is what I generally do there. And then I like to keep it to auto for the rate. I find that it automatically detects a good rate for a hyperlapse. And then for the lens, I generally like to keep that set to wide unless I'm doing something like biking or driving a car and I really want that wider perspective around the camera. But if you are in a city and there's buildings or there's people that you don't want fisheye with, I recommend doing standard dewarp. but generally I just keep it set to wide by default. And for the parameters on this mode, I recommend doing the one change that I made to the other, with the EV value setting it to -0.3. And then for the ISO for this mode, I generally do the 100 to 1600. White balance, I like to put this manually if it's during the daytime, 5600K. If it's sunrise or sunset, 6500K. And then if it is nighttime, I like 3800K. In color mode, I want this to match whatever my other color mode is. So in this case, I want to do D-Log M 10-bit because I like to grade later on. But if you're not going to grade, I recommend the normal 10-bit. And then my image adjustments, I want to adjust those to match my other settings as well. So -2 for both of those. And then if we go back up here again, we can set the time-lapse mode. For the time-lapse mode, DJI has a bunch of pre-configured defaults here, which are great if you just want a simple start it up and go with your time-lapse. But what I like to do is I like to first of all go up here and change it to 4K. And I like to put it to 4K 30. And then down here, I like to do custom, because I do like to have control over my parameters here. So I can swipe up, and here's where you set the interval. So if you're doing a sunset or daytime time lapse, I recommend anywhere between 2 seconds and 5 seconds. I generally keep it right there at about 2 if I'm doing a couple hours. But if the time lapse is going to be longer than a couple hours, I recommend doing closer to 5 seconds. And then for the duration, you can set the duration if you want, and it's going to show you how long the finished product would be. So 30 minutes of actual time if this is capturing will yield a 30-second time lapse at the end. But I usually set this to infinity because I like to control when I start and stop it. And by the way, speaking of time lapses, I do recommend having a power bank for a time lapse like this one right here from Anker. You can plug in the USB-C cable right here, and that's going to make sure that your battery doesn't run out. But do note that if you have this door open, your camera is not going to be waterproof. So if it does rain or snow hard, water could get into your camera. So I do recommend only doing that if you know it's not going to rain or your camera's not going to get wet. And then for the parameters for the time lapse over here, I'm going to set exposure to -0.3, and I'm going to set the ISO range to 100 over 1600. And sometimes with the time lapse, I also like to set a static shutter speed. That way that's not going to change and it's not going to have flickering in the time lapse. So if I do that, what I do is I like to look at the EV value up here. And usually when I do that, I like to set static values for the entirety of the exposure triangle, which of course the aperture on the lens, that's static, you can't change that. But the ISO I like to set to 100. And then usually the shutter speed here, I'll just set it to whatever gets me that balanced exposure to start it off. If it is a sunset, then it is going to get darker and darker, and the camera is going to go along with that darkness without brightening. So do note that. And also if you're using ND filters, if you put an ND filter on, you can get a slower shutter speed, which can be very appealing with time lapses because it'll give that motion a lot smoother look and a lot less choppy. I'll talk about that more so in a future video, but I did want to note that is something you can do here. But I'm going to go back to auto, and I'm going to keep it at my -0.3. And I'm going to keep my ISO range at 100 to 1600. And for the white balance, I like to keep that set manual. I don't like it changing during a time lapse, so I'm going to keep it at 5600K for the daytime. And then for the format, I'm going to change that to video plus raw. So what that's going to do is it's going to give me a finished product video, but it's also going to give me individual raw files. So if I do decide I want to do more editing later on, I have all of those pictures that I can individually edit and put together into a time lapse. But if you know for sure you're not going to want to do that, then I recommend keeping the format set to video. And you'll get a single MP4 file output at the end. And those are all the modes. And here are presets. And just a couple other things I wanted to mention here before we wrap up. If you do want to transfer files to a mobile device, you can connect the camera to the DJI Mimo app, and then you can tap the playback icon to preview photos and video. And the nice thing is within the DJI Mimo app, if you want to do any basic editing and sharing, you can do it inside the app. And you can easily transfer files wirelessly from your Osmo Action 5 Pro to the DJI Mimo app. And those transfer very quickly because this does have Wi-Fi 6 built into it. So it's much faster than they were with the Osmo Action 4. And of course, you also can transfer these to a computer, as I mentioned earlier, using the USB-C cable. And if you would like to use this camera as a webcam, if you plug it into the USB-C cable, you can connect it and use the webcam option. So it is nice to use for that as well. And I will have a lot more videos coming with the Osmo Action 5 Pro. I'm going to show you a lot more samples and how to do some more advanced things in those videos, such as ND filters and time-lapse. And also I'll have some night mode tips and how to get the best footage at nighttime and low light using this camera. So if you haven't already subscribed, make sure to subscribe because I'm going to have a lot more content coming that'll show you how to get the very best out of this camera.